Thank you, Connie. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking your time to listen to me speak today. As Connie mentioned, I focus my work mainly on legacy coaching. And while I will talk a little bit about what that means in the grand scheme of things, while most folks like to focus on the big ideas because that's fun, today I'm going to talk about the few tactical steps that it takes to actually build that legacy, as I have found to be the case from the highest performing executives and entrepreneurs that I have worked with. I usually don't talk about this in any sort of interviews or speeches or on stage, but because of the way life works, we happen to be doing this showcase on September 11th, and because the event itself is very personal to me, because I used to work in Tower One, my definition of legacy over time started with 9/11 related takeaway for me. While there's many takeaways from the event, number one thing for me was time. That a lot of people every day, maybe not pass in such a high profile way, but a lot of people don't get to choose when their time is up. You can't buy more time, you can't create more time, you can't even beg for more time. So your time is valuable, and while you need to spend most of it every day paying the bills, paying the mortgage, doing things we don't want to do, doing boring things, responsibilities, I believe that you all make a choice, as I make a choice every day on how to spend my time, and there's always enough time in the day or the week to spend some of it on what matters most. And in that case, it's defining and building your legacy. So, why am I here today? Why am I the person talking about this? Some highlights from my bio were mentioned, but basically I was very fortunate in the last 27, 28 years to have started working very early on at 21 on Wall Street for the biggest firm in the world that traded those products, and reporting directly to the C-suite after about 6 months of work. So as a 21-year-old kid, I had thrust myself into the workforce while I was still in college, and all of a sudden I was reporting to the CEO and COO of this global firm. And the very first meeting I had with them, it was apparent to me that something was different. They thought differently than other people that I'd met in the business world already. They interpreted events differently. Their perspective of everything from challenges to opportunities was different. They were thinking on a bigger, broader, universal level. And over the next 4.5 years, I got to build two businesses, one in New York and one in London for the firm, and go through a big series of highs and lows. But it's a very unique situation because most of corporate America does not function like Wall Street functions, at least not on the trading and brokerage side. It's kind of like a zoo. It's kind of like Animal Planet. There's really a lot of basic primal rules about how everything is done. But I left Wall Street, and my next endeavor was in the entertainment business. First for a small film company in New York because I had a passion to leave, finance. But then when I moved to Los Angeles, I was very quickly thrust into the world of reality TV. And because of my business background and having a creative background, I had a unique skill set. And at the time, I was recruited by the folks that produced The Apprentice to be a producer on that show. Now, I was very nervous because I'd never done any reality producing before, and all of a sudden it's the #1 show. But really early on, I realized my job was to create relationships with and manage expectations of these big CEOs in America. Men, women, sometimes founders, but usually big corporate CEOs. And again, I started working with them in a really deep capacity, in the sense that they were afraid to tell certain people on the creative side what they really wanted to do with their business because they were afraid that it wouldn't show up on the screen. So I got to talk to these people on a really personal level. And after that, a few other ups and downs, I wound up producing Undercover Boss. And the first 2 seasons of that show, I interviewed about 400 executives to be on the show, and 30-something wound up on those first 2 seasons. But again, through that process, I learned 2 things. 1, that I'm a great listener, and 2, that people wanted to tell me everything about themselves. So that process of interviewing was very personal and very open. And over the course of 2.5 years, there were about 700 executives total out of the Fortune 1000 C-suite that I had met with. I eventually left that business, did a number of other things that Connie talked about, but always retained these relationships, and those executives became investors, advisors, friends, confidants, and I started coaching through a backdoor way, actually, because I've lived this pretty resilient lifestyle, not so much by purpose, but just because I refuse to give up and I like taking massive risks. So everything that I saw myself doing, but not on the scale of these big executives, I actually realized was an emotional connection. So what's the takeaway from all this? Basically, there were three things that I learned that whether they were founders who sold their companies for billions of dollars or corporate executives in the C-suite for the biggest companies in the world, they all did these three things exceptionally well. And yes, they thought strategically and they thought in big scales, but at the end of the day, you actually have to do the work. And a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of unsexy stuff that goes along with that. So today I'm going to talk to you about the process of the three greatest things that these folks do unequivocally exceptionally better than their peers. Number one, they are able to prioritize. They're able to prioritize their lives, their responsibilities, what demands their attention, what demands their time. How do they do that? There are three steps to doing that. They all create a value system. Most, if not all, these companies nowadays have a mission statement. When you walk in, their core values, usually they align to some degree with that chief executive's values. Those values need to not only be stated to the public, they need to be lived, and they need to be lived through actions of the company. So the first thing they do is they define a value system. The second thing they do is create a system for filtering every possible demand on their time, resources, money, employees, etc. How do they do that? There's a lot of different ways to filter your responsibilities. I personally am a big fan of Greg McKeown, who wrote Essentialism. The basic tenet of that philosophy is that if you don't prioritize your time, someone else will, and you need to figure out filters through every decision that comes in. You can say, this is a 90% or more yes that aligns with my values and my mission, and ignore everything else. So through a number of different ways, they're able to prioritize. And the final thing is once they have set their core values, and once they've prioritized them, they're goal setters on a really, really crazy level. They're paper goal setters, they're electronic goal setters. They set goals daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, some of them out 3, 5, 10 years. One of the most successful ones I'd ever met, the first day he took over as CEO, he took out a little piece of paper on his desk and he wrote down a number of companies he was going to buy in his sector to become the biggest company ever in history in that sector. And he put it in his desk, didn't show anybody else, but over time he was able to justify those purchases to his board. And 15 years later, he was the number one company on the planet by size, and he gobbled up every one of those folks. Even when they gobbled up a company bigger than theirs, that company assumed their name because of the brand he'd built. So goal setting through prioritization and value setting gives you the data by which you're going to use to judge everything else that you do in your business. Number one, prioritization. The second thing they're really good at is focus. They focus like hawks. One of the greatest things that I have ever been able to accomplish personally, and it sounds kind of cheesy, was I was great at the job I did on Wall Street, not because I was a math whiz or because I had a better education than anybody else. In fact, I dropped out of college before I finished. It was because I was what they called a screen hawk. I had the capacity to dial in and focus on 30, 40, 50 prices on multiple screens and track them second by second by second and hit a keyboard or yell out in the trading pit before somebody else could. These guys and gals in their own realms are focused freaks, scary. No matter what's going on, they're focused on their mission. How do they get that focus? They build a confidence in resilience. They know that everything that's going to happen to them, they're going to survive and they're going to thrive. So what does that mean? That means throughout their days and their weeks and their years, as they're approaching these goals and trying to attain them, they're going to hit challenges and obstacles. Some they can predict, some are totally out of left field. A factory blows up, a world event happens, recession hits, whatever it might be. Having data that you know have supported your goals and having the ability to prioritize them and having the ability to know that no matter what happens, you're still going to get back on track, that provides confidence. And confidence is the number one characteristic that I attribute to these folks. They're confident to an almost irrational level. They have an almost irrational belief in themselves and their missions. Some of them, when I work with them, the goals they set, they refuse to even tell their board because the board would say, you're crazy if you're reaching for up here, you should reach for down here. What do you do once you have a plan, goals, data, you have the confidence that you can execute it? What's to be done? Usually you want to jump to that great third step that's really sexy. But in the middle, what is there? There's all the work you have to do. And quite simply, these folks do work on a tactical level better than anyone that I've ever met. I've seen people over the course of a coffee while I'm having a deep conversation with them write 50, 60, 70 email responses, put them in a draft folder, and then fire them all off when we're done. Doing the work is such an important principle, and it's so simple yet so hard to do that Stephen Pressfield, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book called do the work. And it's all about resistance, what causes us not to want to get out of bed in the morning or not do X, Y, Z. The best way for anyone, whether it's an individual, you're starting a small business, you work for a big company, you're a founder, you are an academic, the best way for anyone to do work and make sure that they hit those goals is through accountability. What does accountability mean? You could be in a mastermind, like the folks in this audience that are with Connie, great mastermind. You could have a coach. A lot of folks have coaches or mentors. You might even just have an accountability buddy. I'm writing a book, and I just have an accountability buddy every week that we fill in on a Google Sheet how many words that we wrote towards our goal, and you're chasing that person. And just the fact that you have someone else counting on you means you're going to work harder. So, what's next? You have goals, you have the capacity to execute, you're doing the work. The third and the most important part of this journey is to be able to tell your story in a compelling way so that you gain advocacy from the most important stakeholders in your life. They could be your board, your customers, fellow employees. It's most likely your spouse is ranked up there way high, especially if you're an entrepreneur. But the ability to tell a story in a way that people want to believe and want to get behind is the most important part of the work that I do with these folks. And it's the biggest skill set that they have. They can get in front of a microphone, they can type in front of a keyboard, they can get on an interview on the news, whatever it might be. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they're storytellers, as good as any that I've ever met in Hollywood. What does it mean to tell a story? It means that you have data, real data in the corporate sense. You have data that you have now culled over the course of this whole process that supports a narrative. It shows progress over time with marked, real metric measurability. So you have a goal, you've hit your goal, you're telling the world about it. What do you do now? You grow your blank. You could have a charity, you could have a business, you could be growing your personal brand. Whatever all this work was for, you're able to experience exponential growth compared to your peers because you have this system and you've stuck with it. Once you grow something, what is it in service of? That's the whole point of the legacy side of this. You don't just grow a business for the sake of growing a business. You don't just start a charity for the sake of starting a charity. You should have a bigger goal which relates to a legacy. How do I personally define legacy? It is that which you leave behind that is a clear and consistent message that is undoubtedly more than you took while you were here. So, I like to tell folks, if you were not to wake up tomorrow by some horrible circumstance, and all the people that you loved you, respected you respected, the people that counted on you and depended on you, they all show up at your funeral, and we're all standing around this, grave mourning, and somebody says, that guy Damon, what was his deal? The message should be consistent and clear from every single person. It might be deeper or it might be a little bit more shallow in the way they communicate it, but there should be no denying that. And the way that you do that, as other people have spoke about today, is you control that narrative. And you control that narrative not just by saying, I want to do this, I want to make X change, but by showing consistent data and progress towards that through these systems. Now, I believe that everyone has a legacy that they can leave that is unique. I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and not just the fact that everybody has a story to tell, but you could have 10 people go through the same experience. 10 people could go down in a plane crash. You're going to have 10 survivors that tell different stories about what they feel that they took out of that experience that they're able to share with others who are going to improve their lives and make their lives better. So the whole point of this legacy arc, from defining goals, prioritizing, learning focus, living a lifestyle of resilience, doing the work, telling the story, ultimately is to improve someone else's life so that when you're gone, hopefully generations past, there are people who are going to live 2.0, 3.0 versions of themselves because Evans was a part of their life. Evans did X, Y, Z and made sure that when he was gone, at some point, that legacy was going to live on and those resources were going to be there. So ultimately, what I like to do is start off with folks talking about their legacy in the sense of, if anything was possible, what would you want to leave behind? And you think without any barriers, just as if you were a child. And then ultimately, you start carving it away at that until there's something that emotionally meets that benefit, but is realistically possible. And that's basically all I wanted to share with you guys today. It was a more tactical approach to something as strategic and as big thinking as legacy.